Hello, everybody. This is Constance from Mysterious Galaxy. I am very excited tonight because we are celebrating Halley Sutton's new book, The Lady Upstairs. And she's going to be in conversation with Wendy Heard. And her most recent book, I believe, is Hunting Annabelle. Correct me if I'm wrong on that. Do you have a, but I believe that's the most recent one. And I am super, super excited. I'm going to go ahead and pass it off to Wendy in just a second. But first, house rules for everyone, the Vanna White section, as we call it. If you look down below where it says ask a question, that is where you can indeed ask our authors a question. And that's why you're here, to get to interact with them. So make sure you ask whatever questions you have, because I think that's the most fun part. And also, the best way to support an author is to purchase their book. Also, too, you are stuck at home, so you need entertaining things to do for your brain cells. So I would highly recommend that you click that buy book button down below, and you can get a signed, and not only signed, but personalized book plate as well. That is pretty much it. I'm going to pass it off to Wendy, but first, just to set the atmosphere a little bit, the lady upstairs. So our main protagonist, some people may question the morality of her job. She blackmails bad people, so I will leave that up to you to judge. But as things are wont to do in stories, things don't go so well for her in one of the epically large cons she tries to do. That's all I'm going to say, because that was enough to pull me in, and I will let them talk more about it. So Wendy, go ahead and take it away, and I will see you guys at the end of the event.
Uh-oh, now we're unsupervised.
I know.
How are you, Hallie?
I'm doing well. Thank you so much for being in conversation with me tonight. And thank you, Constance. Oh, Wendy, are you muted? I can't hear you.
It looks like you are muted, Wendy. I'm not sure.
Yeah, somehow you're on mute.
If you hover over your screen and click the mic button, it should unmute you.
How's that? You hear me okay?
Yay! Yay, she's back.
Yeah, it just dropped my mic out for some reason. I just refreshed it. Sorry about that.
No problem.
So anyway, I'm so excited to be here with you, Hallie.
Thank you.
And congratulations on the release of your first novel, The Lady Upstairs.
Thank you. You have you've known this book since it was in early infancy stages, back in the Pitch War days.
So that's kind of funny. Hallie was a participant in Pitch Wars when I was a mentor. And Pitch Wars is a contest where you kind of like compete to get mentored by a more established author. Mm-hmm. And you have this massive slush pile you're looking through with all these, really talented people. And so I'm sitting here looking through it and I'm like, ooh, look at this project. And my friend Lane is like, get away from it. That is mine. I was like, okay, all right. You've already bonded with this project. And that was yours.
Yes. And I think Lane Fargo is definitely here tonight. And she's the author of Thrillers Temper and They Never Learn, which are both books.
Yeah, so I have loved your book from the very beginning. It has a ton of voice and it's really interesting. So let's start off by you telling us a little bit about your book. It's called The Lady Upstairs. It's a noir and it's set here in Los Angeles. So why don't you tell us a little about it?
Sure. So The Lady Upstairs is a modern feminist noir, as you said, set in Los Angeles, about a group of women who run a blackmail agency targeting bad, powerful, corrupt men in the city. And when the book opens, as Constance mentioned, our main character, Joe, is in the middle of a sting targeting a lecherous Hollywood producer, kind of a notorious casting couch king type. And the sting isn't going super well. The woman that she's hired to seduce him, Ellen, is having these qualms of conscience, doesn't really want to be involved in the business anymore. And that's a problem for Jo for a couple of reasons, including that this is the job that's going to finally even out her debt with her boss, a woman that she only knows as the lady upstairs.
Okay. And then shenanigans ensue.
Yes. And it only gets worse from there.
So tell me a little bit about the main character.
So Jo is kind of this hard-drinking, flinty, sarcastic femme fatale, kind of like a very noir throwback archetype of the femme fatale, but she also has this kind of she wants to be a much more hardened woman in character than she is. And as the book starts out, she's kind of able to contain that. And as the book goes on, it starts to spill out in more and more disastrous ways. The fact that she is not actually as hardened a woman as she would like to be.
And she has a little bit of a romantic interest in her colleague.
Oh, and both of her colleagues, really. So at the blackmail agency that they run, there are three characters who are really kind of the main central staff, if you will. There's Jo, there's Lou, who's Jo's best friend, and a little something more. There's always kind of this romantic tension between them. But she's also kind of like the house manager, the liaison for the lady upstairs, and the woman who got Jo involved in doing what they're doing today. And then there's also Robert Jackal, who is the kind of muscle and photographer and Jo's sometime paramour. And Jo has much more complicated, convoluted relationships with both of those characters than she would care to admit, particularly at the start of the novel.
And did you enjoy writing this world?
I did very much. It was really fun to kind of steep myself in noir, particularly because when I first started writing it, I had just first moved here to Los Angeles. I know you're a Los Angeles native, so you probably have a very different experience of the city than I do. But moving here from Northern California and not really knowing LA very well, to me, what was so shocking when I first moved here was kind of the juxtaposition between like very real Los Angeles where people live and then like mythology Los Angeles, where the way that people think of Los Angeles and Hollywood, and that it's kind of this glitz glamorous thing that is there, but is not necessarily like real. And so that was something that I had a lot of fun kind of diving into and trying to understand better, both for the book and then also for the new city that I was living in.
So would you say that your characters live in real LA or mythology LA?
I think they have passports and go back and forth between them.
Yeah, because there were parts of this book that felt very real to me. I mean, obviously, the whole thing with the work that they do and why they do it. Tell us a little bit more about the type of men that they target.
So the type of men that they go after tend to be men who have not really faced repercussions for their actions, for their predatory actions. And there's a wide spectrum of that. When the book opens, this lecherous casting couch king that Jo is kind of targeting is kind of, pretty analogous in some ways to Harvey Weinstein, and has just kind of operated with impunity for years. And later, as the book goes on, you find out that they've also gone after corrupt cops. They've gone after city officials. As the book progresses, Jo gets involved in a sting targeting this mayoral candidate who's married to a woman who's like very deeply entrenched in like old Los Angeles, which is kind of a funny concept because at least for like most of the rest of the world, Los Angeles is not that old, but that has this kind of accrued power that protects him and the shenanigans that he gets up to.
And those types of men, I mean, it's interesting because being from LA, you really feel like most of what people see is wrong, right?
Uh-huh.
You feel like most of it is not real LA. It almost feels like LA as interpreted through the lens written by people who moved here from other places with an idea about what LA is. So it's almost like this weird cyclical perpetuating fake LA cycle or something.
It makes me think of that documentary, which I've only seen parts of, but Los Angeles Plays Itself, which is about all the ways in which Los Angeles is basically fictionalized and used in film and TV. And like the weird way that because we see it that way, that's like what people who don't live here think LA is.
But then at the same time, I was thinking about your book and I was remembering that when I was like maybe 7 or so. I had moved to LA from San Diego. I was living in like a tiny little apartment in North Hollywood. Not a good area. I didn't grow up with money. And my neighbor was a little boy, and Michael Jackson used to pick him up in his limo and just drive him around for a while and then drop him back off.
Oh, no.
And I didn't really know anything about it. My mom at the time was like, that's weird. And the kid's mom was like, it's Michael Jackson.
Yeah.
Well, we were poor, felt special and stuff like that. So I was like, in that way, LA very much is exactly how you see it on TV. You know what I mean?
And I think, what's so sad about instances like that, or like Harvey Weinstein, I mean, a bunch of them, is really just the way that like celebrity becomes a shield. Because like you said, I mean, maybe I don't want to put any sort of judgment on anyone's parenting, but you could question what's going on there. But also it's Michael Jackson. And like,
this was before he had, there was any of the exposés and stuff, this predated that by a few years. So I don't know. I was just thinking about that. Like your portrayal of LA, it's so real. And I think at the same time, it's so strange that you feel like it can't be really like that.
That Michael Jackson can't just drive somewhere North Hollywood and come
pick up some kid.
Yeah.
But he can.
I mean, I kind of think that speaks to like some of what I think is so creatively generative about Los Angeles. Like why books like this keep being set here is that like we do have that kind of veneer of glitz and glamour, and also that like perfect weather year round and the sunshine and the palm trees and the beach. And yet there's this like pretty rotten core historically that goes through Los Angeles's history, like just such a history of corruption and bad things happening here. I think that juxtaposition is like very fruitful for a lot of people. I know you have written The Kill Club, your most recent novel, was set in Los Angeles, and you do such a good job of making it very like, I found it to be one of the more real portrayals of like Los Angeles as a city that I recognized as a real city reading The Kill Club.
I wanted it to just feel like my hometown. I also wanted to write LA through the lens of blue collar people, which is what most of the city is. That's the thing.
Yeah.
But you wouldn't really know that.
No, that's not the part that gets publicized. And there is extreme wealth here in Los Angeles too. Like there's really extreme wealth. Yeah, it's very stratified city.
It is. I find that, I don't know, when you moved to LA, what did it look like to you? Because you were coming from Humboldt County, and for people who are watching who are not from California, there's like a real rift between Northern and Southern California. You don't see a lot of Northern California people moving to LA. They actually hate LA. And LA people do not actively hate Northern Californian people in return, right? And that's kind of an interesting thing. It's like, if you ask me about the Bay Area where my dad lives, I'll be like, oh, I love it up there. The weather's nice and cold, and, amazing, beautiful city, San Francisco, fun to take the BART. If you ask him about LA, it's like a swampy cesspool. Why would anybody live there? It's disgusting.
Yeah, it definitely is interesting because you're right. It's a one-way rivalry. And I feel like Angelinos, for lack of a better term, like are aware of the rivalry, and it just kind of bounces off them. They're like, oh, San Francisco's so great. I love the Bay Area. Whereas I think it like definitely is not fairly the same in reverse. And I actually have some of my Bay Area friends on the chat here tonight. So I see.
It's true, right? It's funny. I'd be curious to see them in the chat, but it's totally a weird rivalry that LA people are sort of like clueless about. Like, we're like, we don't get it.
Right. My friend Shelby says she doesn't care. But yeah, so I moved here. I actually moved here. So I grew up in Humboldt County, and I moved here from the Bay Area. And it was kind of a culture shock, but I was surprised by, Los Angeles has this reputation for artificiality, which is definitely true, at least in parts of the city, but I was also surprised by how real it felt, and kind of maybe in some ways more real than the Bay. Not that I'm trying to start like another Rift thing here tonight, but like I immediately kind of felt at home here in a different way than I had felt in the Bay Area.
People are very direct in a way that they aren't as much in Northern California, right? People in LA are just very friendly or very rude or very whatever, but they're just open about it.
And there's more murder bus tours here, which like immediately made me feel like I'd found my tribe. So
yeah, I don't think I've seen a murder bus tour of San Francisco. I've seen haunted San Francisco stuff, which is really cool.
that is
But I
true.
don't know about murder bus tours. Yeah. I was curious about that because normally you and I would be doing this event together. Like we'd be sitting next to each other because we're friends, and we like drive down to San Diego and do the, the bookstore event together. So it's funny.
Yeah.
Yeah. So moving on to actual questions, I wanted to ask you more about your murder bus tour theme. Tell me about some interesting true crime LA real noir stuff that you find has really affected you or influenced you.
Los Angeles, kind of going back to like the mythology that Los Angeles cloaks itself in, and like the way that is played into noir. I mean, you can't really get away from the Black Dahlia murder, which is interesting because I know historically it's had more of a revival in the last like 20 years or so, that wasn't necessarily for a long period of time the obsession with it that there is now. And that's a murder that I find really interesting because I think kind of along the lines of maybe Jack the Ripper and a few other murders, like even if it were to get definitively solved, people don't really necessarily want a closed answer to that. I think that it is serving some sort of greater cultural placeholder, keeping it this kind of mystery, this unknown. And maybe that's partially true because it's, decades removed from us, and that you're not kind of faced with that human cost, which there is so frequently in true crime, like the really real cost of people who are affected by this. But I think that it has this kind of interesting place in Los Angeles mythology, and its tie into noir, that she got this nickname of being the Black Dahlia because she used to wear a flower in her hair, but it was also connected to the Raymond Chandler penned screenplay, The Blue Dahlia. It's kind of a quintessential LA murder, and yet it kind of also plays into those problematic tropes of the, pretty dead white woman, which is not the majority of the crime that happens in this city, but it is the majority of the crime that gets kind of elevated and turned into this like star power wattage event. What about you? I know that you too have some interest in true crime spanning California. Do you have particular?
The Black Dahlia murder is really interesting. You're right. It is an icon. It's like iconography. It is like, that is the type of murder that we are really interested in. It's the type of murder that turns a woman into a dead thing, right? And I think it's like this culture of dehumanizing and objectifying women in general that was like, she was already a doll, now she's a dead doll,
Right. And it's so interesting too when you look at the Black Dahlia, which there are so many murder bus tours that have sprung up around it. There's a Black Dahlia cocktail at the Biltmore Hotel that actually I sampled sometime.
She was drinking there in 1946.
Yeah, exactly.
You got it when we were together.
I did. And that was, I think, in January of this year, which actually 10 years ago. So that was a different version of me. And Sharon Tate, as Sherry pointed out too, but at the same time, we had this recent serial killer, the Grim Sleeper, who was operating basically with impunity in parts of Los Angeles and murdering like dozens of women. And yet those murders are not like, I couldn't, off the top of my head, I could not name one of his victims, which is a failing of mine, but is also a failing of like whose death gets exalted and why.
Who gets like memorialized.
Right.
And what good does it do her? She's dead. Her life was taken from her. So it's worse. It's worse upon worse upon worse. Right.
It's not something you want to be remembered for.
It's no accident that my favorite murder happens here, is by Angelenos.
Yeah.
Because you're right. Los Angeles has a very unique flavor of crime and true crime culture around. I personally, my fascination is with the Cecil Hotel, the Hotel Cecil. That one, do you want to hear like a little quick history?
Always, yes.
Cecil? So it's downtown, relatively close to Skid Row, in an area that has fluctuated a lot. It's downtown is always in flux. It was known for a string of suicides in the 40s and 50s. It was known as the suicide. For some reason, it attracted that. Huh. And then there was a woman in the 60s who was, brutally murdered there. And then in the 80s, Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker, stayed there while he was stalking women on Skid Row. And then another serial killer stayed there in the 1991, copying what's his face. It's funny. I don't even like to say their names, right?
He who must not be named.
And then the thing that got me interested in it was that in 2013, there was this story that was everywhere. Her name was Elisa or Eliza Lamb. And she was this young student staying there. And they caught her on video, like talking to herself in the elevator, getting on and off the elevator, talking to someone, pushing all the buttons, like desperate. Something's wrong with her. And then she disappeared. And a little while later, residents of the hotel started complaining that the water tasted wrong, tasted strange. And they found her in the water cistern.
Yeah, that's not.
And it was ruled an accident, but she was like in this cistern. Like if you see it, I don't know how she could have gotten in there. And it was closed behind her. And she was naked.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's so frustrating too when there are deaths like that have so many unanswered questions. I mean, whether or not it was some sort of suicide or some sort of psychotic break, or if she was murdered or pushed, or like who knows. But to kind of just chalk it up as if to say like, well, we don't know. Here's our best guess type thing. I don't know. It's very frustrating.
And I think that the official cause of death was ruled accidental. And she had bipolar disorder. And so it said it was like exacerbated by bipolar disorder or something. It was like, but that really sticks in my mind.
I'm not a person who believes in like juju or vibes, but surely the Hotel Cecil has some bad juju at work.
What's up with that?
I don't know. Not booking a stay anytime soon, COVID or no COVID.
Sharon in the chat says that Nicole Brown Simpson comes to mind.
Another person who, gets kind of remembered for her death in this way that no one would ever really, you wouldn't want that to be the sum total of your life or why people remember you or think of you.
And then it's funny because I was in, middle school when the O.J. Simpson thing went down. And I feel like that kind of sparked a generation of like true crime Angelinos.
I mean, I don't actually remember how old I was when that happened, which is like playing coy. I don't. But I could do.
You were much younger. You're much younger than me.
Yeah. But I mean, it seems like it was such a present crime for Los Angeles and encapsulated so many of the things from, the Rodney King beating to kind of the attitudes about race in the city and celebrity, and the way that all of these things intersected made it kind of this like the Los Angeles crime, really.
Yeah.
About like kind of the most emblematic crimes.
Yeah. LA's a weird place for crime. That's why I like to see you writing noir the way you do. Because I feel like you're just like taking it back. Like you're taking noir back in a way that I think a lot of LA writers wish they could. It's really great.
Thank you. I think I'm curious to hear if this is similar to your process, but for me, it was helpful in that way to, I think Raymond Chandler is a genius. I think he's a genius prose stylist. I think he writes about he like sets the bar for Los Angeles noir, really. You could argue like he's really up there. But I have a bunch of bones to pick with him and a lot of things in his writing that, irritated me or that didn't feel true, particularly about his female characters. And so for me, it was very helpful to kind of have that thing that I'm writing against, to look at this example and go, like, this is great, but also what about all of this? And so for me, that was kind of a fun piece of writing the novel.
So would you read us an excerpt?
Sure, I would love to. I will read a short excerpt from the second chapter of the book. So what we have missed in the first chapter is that Joe this is the day that the sting is supposed to be closed. They're supposed to have gotten photos of this lecherous producer, and it didn't happen. Robert Jackal, who's the photographer, never showed up. And so she's meeting her best friend Lou at a tiki bar, allegedly to celebrate, and she has to find a way to break the news to Lou that this didn't go as planned. So,
all right, let's hear it.
Here we go. Lou sat at a table uncluttered by other admirers. She was the best-looking woman in the bar. I was big enough to admit that. She was one of those beautiful women who never took much care of her face at all. The humidity had caused her mascara to bloom under her eyes, and her bright copper hair was damp at the temples. The heat had softened her like warm chocolate. Here's my idea of a good bar. A clean, ill-lighted space. No pink drinks, no hula statuettes, certainly no dangling stuffed parrots strangled by fairy lights. But this bar had Lou. She looked up, smiled. The drink in front of her was so orange it glowed, turning the underside of her chin the color of a sunrise. It looked like the sort of drink that made you hug strangers before you hugged a toilet. Spring break already? I slid into the seat across from her, catching the glass with the tip of my finger and stealing a sip from her straw. An explosion of sugar and foam and one sickly zing of rum down my throat. I grimaced and Lou laughed. For $6 a pop, you can rewire your palate, she said, grabbing the little purple umbrella from the glass and tucking it behind my ear. I brushed the garnish out of my hair and onto the floor. Lou laughed again, a full-throated sound. I could feel the disappointment and panic still tugging at me, but it was easier to ignore now, as though one sip of her cocktail had washed the taste of Robert Jackal's failings right out of my mouth. I ordered you the bombs away, Lou said. Since we're celebrating. Celebrating, right. Oh, you ordered for me. You'll like it. You know what I'd say to Jackal if he decided what I'd have without asking? Lou dimpled. I have some idea. You'll drink it because I'm buying. She took another sip. You like the place? Behind Lou, some kid at the jukebox threw on a classic rock song popular at least a decade before he was born, and the carved wooden hula dancer in the corner swayed off beat. Every time someone ordered one of the specialty cocktails, enjoy our blasted good bikini atoll, a Jaeger bomb in the center of a lake of Curacao, a cardboard volcano spewed tissue paper lava, and cardboard people at its base shook and danced. I hate it, I said. You never like anything I like. I don't think that's true. It's just that I have better taste in most things. Lou arched an eyebrow. Robert? Most things. A briny waitress plopped a disturbingly pink mug in front of me, a wilted purple flower starting to capsize in its frothy depths. Bombs away, she said with a smoker's rasp. I crinkled my nose and looked up at Lou skeptically, but she was crackling with delight, waiting to see if I'd actually drink it. I sniffed it, grapefruit and something that made my tongue curl. I took a sip, mezcal, smoky and bitter and juicy. Not bad, I said to Lou. See, I know you better than you think. Lou reached out with one finger and gently tapped the corner of my mouth with her nail. A bead of sweat rolled along the inside of my knee, tickling. Is that a new lipstick? No need to dress up for little old me. Lou cracked that lopsided grin and her hand went back to her drink. A little red smudge lingered on it, then on the glass. I resisted the urge to swipe at my lips. I might be paying Jackal a visit later. And it was true, I might do that. There were many things I might do later that evening. I don't know if that means he's a lucky man or a very unlucky one. Someone's got to keep him in line. Lou chuckled a little. Always a thing for the bad boys, she teased. What use do either of us have for boys? Lou smiled at me, her face glowing. So, how did it go with Klein? Tell me. Jackal didn't show, that's how it went, I thought but didn't say. He's rough with her, I said, trying to think up the best way to break the bad news. Lou lifted one shoulder in a half shrug, but her eyes were still twinkling, so I knew it was a challenge, not a letdown. Boring. Besides, that can be fun. I took another sip of my drink, going down easier all the time. Not when you're the man who's made a living as the kindly cardigan grandfather of Hollywood. It was the thing Lou had taught me to do well, walk through the pitch ahead of time. So you've got pictures of me naked with some broad. What do I care? Let 'em see. You always had to have an answer. Besides recruiting and training the girls, it was the most important part of my job, crafting the pitch for maximum payout. And for Klein, I had the pitch down pat. Just no pictures yet. I'll end there. Thank you.
I love it. I was so excited when you started reading that because I love that scene.
Oh, thank you so much. It's one of my favorite scenes too, and I felt like it would be fun to read today as we're all trapped indoors to think of other times at bars with other people.
And I have been to Tiki Bar with you.
Yes, you have. Yes, you have.
And you ordered a fruity drink.
That sounds like me.
I like this scene because, first of all, I was like, is this sexual tension between girls?
Yes, it is.
Yes, it is. I also like this scene because you really get into the like nitty gritty and nuts and bolts of what that job would be like. Like, how do I pitch this for maximum payout?
Thank you. Yeah, that was actually a piece that came to me later. I don't know what your process of revising is like, but when I revise, I read a lot of it out loud. I actually read the book out loud several times to kind of try to get a feel for the rhythm and the flow of things. And weirdly, that was just something that on one of my revision passes came out where I was like, a big part of this would be not just getting the photos, but it would be convincing the marks that this can hurt them. Because with men who kind of have reigned with this impunity, they're used to being able to buy their way out of these situations. So what are you going to say when they're like, sure, send it to the papers. I don't care. You have to be able to craft a narrative in this way that can show them how damaging it could be.
I find that really interesting, especially because, like you said, I could imagine a lot of guys being like, what do I care? Am I going to lose my film career because I cheated on my wife? Like, right, nobody cares.
You should be so lucky as to see all this naked, which I think is what is a thought process.
So, did you always know you wanted to write noir?
I would say no, actually. When I kind of rededicated myself to writing in my mid-20s, when I really kind of like sat down with it and was like, if I want to write a book, it's never going to just write itself. I have to actually write it, I guess, which
is rude.
Yeah, I don't really understand what that's about. I was reading at the time a lot of Kelly Link and Carmen Maria Machado and Alice Sola Kim, and was kind of thinking that I was going to go in this more speculative fiction vein, which I still have like immense love for those types of stories and those writers, but turns out that's not really where my brain is. And so when I kind of came up with the idea for The Lady Upstairs, and was like, oh, it's a noir, it was kind of this like light bulb moment. Like, of course it's a noir. You've been obsessed with murder your whole life and you Google serial killers to fall asleep to. So like, yeah, you're a crime writer. And then I was like, oh, right. This feels right.
But you have an MFA, right?
I do, yes, from Otis College of Art and Design.
So what was it like being in an MFA program and kind of wanting to be a genre writer?
I think that there are a lot of programs where genre writing is kind of stigmatized, and I never really Otis. Part of it might be that one of my professors had a saying. I actually got to study with Paul Evangelisti, who's a poet, who's a noir poet, and just has like this incredible wealth of noir knowledge. And that ended up being kind of, almost like a happy accident where that wasn't the reason why I went to that program, but it ended up being so great. And I kind of would bend his ear about stuff because he had such deep knowledge of noir that he was also a very good barometer for me when it was like skewing too deep into being like a low rent Raymond Chandler, and was kind of steering me towards finding my own voice again. But I would say everybody was very supportive. And one of my other professors had this saying that I think is very true, which he said, basically all novels are crime novels at heart. There's always some sort of crime that's been committed, whether it's emotional or actual crime. But all novels are crime novels. And I really like that. And I think that's true.
Yeah, because I think a lot of us crime writers feel sort of like it's tough to be pigeonholed. Is it a thriller? Is it a mystery? Is it a domestic thriller? Is it, because a lot of stories have many different parts of them. Like, for example, you could have a protagonist who's married. There's conflict in the marriage and maybe danger. but they're also politicians. So it's a political thriller. You know, we have all this interesting like genre pigeonholing.
Right, right. Which I think can be useful from a marketing standpoint. You know, I do helps readers find things that they love, being able to be like, this is like this other book that I really loved. But I do agree with you. I think that it can be pigeonholing, and you don't ever want to kind of try to write something only because that's what you've been told is your type of book or your type of story.
But interestingly, I would say you accomplished something that I've always wanted to ask you about, actually. I've never asked you about this.
Oh, exciting.
When you read a noir book, you know you're reading noir based on the voice. What is that?
We're all adults here. So I think to me, noir is one of those genres that's like the closest to that famous line about pornography, which is like, you know it when you see it. Noir has such kind of a tone and style and attitude and I think that there are aspects of noir that have seeped all over into our culture. Like one example would be the TV show, and I know it's graphic novel, Jessica Jones, that takes these kind of noir tropes, but is not in fact like directly a noir. But noir is something that like, it's kind of unmistakable when you see it. It's got this like nihilistic viewpoint, this institution, top down inequity, this sharp voicey kind of rhythm to it. It just is, it's very particular in its genre tropes.
It is. Even down to the way that main character describes things. It feels very noir.
Thank you. I was trying to lean into, you know, Chandler set this precedent of using these really outlandish like metaphors for things. Like there's that great line that's like, I don't remember what he was comparing, but it was something about like a tarantula on a slice of angel food cake, which is such a disturbing, sharp, original, fun image. Like that is a funny thing to compare something to. And I was really trying to like have as much fun with the language there in that way as I could without it coming off like I'm a Kirkland, Raymond Chandler.
Yeah. Okay. I can see that. Yeah, that's something really interesting that I've never been able to define, and I've always wanted to ask you about.
Ah, well, I'm glad you did.
Yeah.
Our 25.
All right, well, let's look at some questions. So for those of you who are here, if you look at the bottom of your screen, there's a little thing that says ask a question. And I'm going to just pull that up, and I'm going to start asking Halley some of these. First of all, first question, how dare you look so good in that green shirt? How dare you?
Dress, actually.
Oh, it's a green dress. Even worse. Next question. What are you working on now or next?
I am working on another LA-based feminist noir that is not a direct sequel to Lady Upstairs, but is kind of a spiritual sequel. And it's about a woman who runs a murder bus tour here in Los Angeles. And in the first chapter, on one of her stops, she encounters an actual dead body. And the dead body turns out to have kind of nebulous ties to the unsolved murder of her sister 20 years before. And so that's kind of the setup and the premise. And a lot of the talk we had about true crime tonight has been kind of what I've been like marinating my brain in thinking about for this novel too.
God, you're just so good at coming up with premises. You're so good at coming up with something that's just, you're just dying to read it.
You are so sweet. You come up with wonderful premises. I don't know if you want to share any of the items you're working on right now, but
no. Moving on.
Okay.
Okay. What part of this book brought you the most joy to write, and what part was the most challenging? I have a guess about the challenging part, but let's hear what you say.
Okay. The most joy. There's two scenes that I really like in terms of joy. One was one that I read from in the tiki bar. I think I guess I just really like to set things in tiki bars. So that's probably like a trademark going forward. But then there's also a scene later in the book that kind of is the backstory between how Lou and Joe met. And that was actually the earliest thing I wrote for the novel ever. A version of that was a short story where I kind of like developed Joe's voice a little bit and then was like, oh, this person is bigger than just a short story. And that's the piece that's made it through all iterations of the novel with the least change. But overall, I would say the part I'm happiest with is the ending. The last few pages of the book are really part probably my favorite. And in terms of, do you want to guess first what you thought was the hardest, or should I say it first?
Yeah, you say it first.
Okay. There was, without giving too much away, Joe gets involved in a different sting operation later in the book, and the seduction scene of that character was the most difficult scene for me to write. Not because I don't enjoy writing sex scenes. Sorry, Mom, I know you're on here, but
she loves writing them. They're her favorite.
But it was more just that I couldn't get the tone to be exactly what I wanted it to be. And I think I wrote like 25 drafts of that scene, and each one was moving it like maybe an inch closer to where I wanted it. And then, so it was extremely satisfying when I got it right, but it was extremely—
You got it really right.
Thank you. But it was extremely frustrating to be like, I know this scene is in the book. It's an important scene, and I just can't figure out why it's not working.
In this interview, you've told me two crucial pieces of information.
Okay.
One, that you read everything out loud, and
Yes.
two, you reminded me of the sex scenes, which has caused me to picture you reading sex scenes out loud in your apartment a million times.
A million times. Yes.
I'm not mature enough.
And even read them out loud during grad school and workshopped them, which was, you know, what's funny is that when you're workshopping sex scenes, like in grad school, at least in my program, it was not as difficult as you would think, because it was kind of like no one wanted to make eye contact with me and no one wanted to those scenes. They were just kind of like, yep, they're fine. Keep going. Like,
you're like, that works.
Right. They did not want to drill down on it. And so that was like the easy workshop days where I was like, oh, okay.
I'm really surprised to hear that, because I don't know that I've ever read a sex scene and not spent some time just vetting it in my head. Like, okay, where are everybody's hands? Did we lose track of some hands?
You have like little dolls you act about with.
Well, like, there's whole bad sex awards. I mean, there's nothing more delightful than coming across a truly terrible sex scene.
And there are so many. Written by both genders, but perhaps dominated by men.
Perhaps not an even distribution among the genders.
Yes, yes.
Moving along, maturely and dignified. Oh, interesting. This is a good follow-up. What do you see the role of sexuality playing into your writing?
Ooh,
You've talked a little bit about the role of sex in writing in general. I find your thoughts on it really interesting.
Oh, thank you. Now I'm trying to remember what I said. So, I mean, essentially the women in the book are sex workers, you know, and that's kind of what they're training women to do in this almost like MLM sort of pyramid scheme a little bit, where you're roping in these girls and you're training them and giving them the ropes. And I was kind of trying to not make a lot of moral comments on what they're doing or why they're doing it in the book. I didn't want that to be kind of the central question about it. At least I didn't want the central question to be about the sex work. I think the maybe central question is like, is this a way to reclaim power, and what happens to you in the course of trying to reclaim that power, which is, I think, very different from sexuality. But for me also, when I was writing the sex scenes, of which there are several, again, sorry, Mom. I think what I actually really enjoyed writing about them was that it was never really about the sex itself. It was almost always about some sort of different emotion or feeling behind it. It was about power or control, or kind of these like relationship games Joe's playing with Jackal, or, you know, connection even, or money at different times. But it was kind of, the headspace I was occupying was really about like, what's the motivation behind the sex scene as opposed to the mechanics of the sex scene. And so for me, that made it much more interesting to write than some of the more erotic pieces, I guess. I could have guessed that, Heather.
You know, I think that this book, now that I'm thinking about it, I feel like you could write a whole essay about the character of sex in this book, because I feel like you have so many different types of sex in this book, in that you have, you know, very what's what I'm looking for? Like it's just there for a job. It's performing a purpose. It's a means to an end. And then you have moments where it's recreational, maybe a manipulation, maybe a power play. And then you have actual like sex for connection or even sexual moments wanting connection. And I almost feel like you're examining that in this book.
Yeah, definitely. I think maybe that wasn't even something I was consciously doing, but I do think that, sex serves so many different purposes, and that often we get told, particularly as women, that it should serve very specific purposes. And in the book, Joe, I wanted Joe to have very different experiences with sex in different ways, and that none of them are necessarily bad in terms of like morality. I mean, again, I think the more immoral thing is the blackmail, but it's that there are different ways that sex can be used, and different ways that people can experience sex, all while occupying the same body.
Yes, it's you're talking about it. It's like you're in a conversation about it, but you, the writer, are not taking a stance. You know what my agent says that reminds me of this? She says the best ways to work with theme are not to make a statement, but to ask a question.
Oh, I like that.
Right? I always remember that when she told me that.
I like that.
And I feel like you do that well in this book.
Oh, thank you.
I think you have a lot of really interesting things to say about sex work and about, I guess, destigmatizing what women do with their bodies and these types of things.
Well, and I think something that you and I have talked about before is that sex work is almost kind of in some ways this like arbitrary umbrella for things. And there's a lot in the book that's like talks about the way that everything is currency, that, you can weaponize a smile and make it currency. You can do that to get away with something, or to get your way with something. And it just, it's interesting what we label sex work and what we label as just work, and you could even look at that. Like what are influencers selling? Like on social media,
right?
Influencers selling.
What is Kim Kardashian selling?
Right. And it's maybe not necessarily sex, but it's also like themselves, which is sort of the same as what is happening with sex work in this different way. And, but it just, I don't know, it's kind of this weird line we hold to, and yet I think it's worth kind of looking at again.
Well, and then there's the idea that sex can be transactional and not necessarily like, I will have sex with you and you will give me $100. But it can be transactional in many other ways.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that I think happens super frequently, and we don't talk about it as sex work, even though it really is not that different.
Yeah. I mean, the joke about marrying someone for their money.
Yeah.
Is that sex work? Interesting.
Yeah.
In this dissertation, we will.
Welcome to our TED Talk.
So, did you research sex work for this book?
I did some research in that I have known people in my life who have either been involved or have known people who are involved in sex work, and so was lucky enough to bend their ear a little bit about some of their experiences. But I would also say that a lot of it was kind of more I kind of wanted to find, and this is like an interesting little weird thing that popped up in my research, is that I was trying to find some sort of agency to model this on, because to the best of my knowledge, this doesn't exist, or if it does exist, it's so underground that they're not, posting it in Vulture or wherever I would find it. But I did find this article about, there's an organization, there's an agency in China where if a woman suspects her husband of being unfaithful, she can hire basically like a mistress distractor, and they will befriend this woman, find something that will fill more of her time in her life, whether that's like a new job or a new boyfriend or a hobby that kind of consumes her, basically to break the bond with the husband and have him return to the wife. And so that's not exactly, that's almost kind of the inverse of what these women are doing. But it was weirdly kind of this parallel idea of like, what an agency like that would look like in real life. And so I kind of got into a deep dive looking at that.
That is fascinating.
Right?
There was a story that came out in the news recently about a world famous megachurch pastor who got caught cheating. He was like the Hillsong pastor, one of those big ones.
Was this the one with the boy? No.
With the what?
The Cabana Boy. This was a different story.
Oh, this is a different one.
Okay.
But I thought of you because the way he got caught, I was just like, every time I see one of these big guys get caught like this, I'm going to think about Halley and her book.
Yes. Joe at work in the world.
Joe is in there doing her thing. Yeah. So here's a question. First of all, was this the first book you ever wrote?
It was the first complete book I ever wrote. Yes, I wrote a NaNoWriMo novel that was 50,000 words, so it wasn't really quite long enough to be a novel, and definitely had. I don't know what the narrative arc of that one was, but I did write a NaNoWriMo novel, and I hope it's dead now and no one can ever find it.
So this is your first. Since this is your first completed book, this question is really only for The Lady Upstairs and then whatever you're writing next. Which is, do you know how it's going to end when you start writing it?
I didn't know how The Lady Upstairs was going to end when I started writing it, although I will say that the ending kind of occurred to me well before I got there. I kind of let myself be loose with it for that book, where I was like, I think this is what I'm writing towards, but if something else occurs to me that I feel is stronger, I'll go with that. But it ended up being the ending that I kind of ended up using. For my second book, I actually have a pretty good idea of the exact arc of the book. And I'm leaving myself open to changing it as the creative process takes me. But I do think I know where I'm going pretty strongly with this book, which is nice because when I wrote The Lady Upstairs, I didn't know all of the plot obstacles I was going to throw in my own way. So then I was creating the plot, and then I had to solve the plot as I was creating it, which was really hard. And now I'm hoping that because I know the kind of central mystery at the heart of my second book, maybe that will be easier.
Or maybe not.
Or maybe not. Don't tell me this. I need to believe.
Or maybe it's just monsters all the way down.
Oh, no.
Oh, Halley. Oh, Halley. Are there any true crime stories that influenced this book or made it into this book?
That's a good question. I don't think there were any direct true crime stories that made it into the book, but I do think that there are true crime references through the book. One of the things, I don't know if you do this, Wendy, and I'm curious, but like writing a novel is such a marathon that there were like little things that I had to do to like keep myself interested in sitting down and doing the hard work of writing every day. So one of those things was packing as many noir allusions as I thought I could get away with into the book, including the love for one of my all-time favorite movies, Body Heat, which I have somehow managed to go 55 minutes without mentioning today. And I do think that there were a couple of different things that you would consider true crime that made it into the book. I think there's a reference to Peg Entwistle somewhere in there, who's the woman who is the actress who unfortunately, tragically jumped to her death off the H of what was at the time the Hollywoodland sign, which is like such an on the nose thing that like an editor would cut it, but like sometimes reality is stranger than fiction. And I think there are a few other things like that. I think my next book is going to be chock-a-block full of true crime references and influence. And Lane, I think that is a new record, yes, of how long I can go before I talk about Body Heat.
What if I told you that I've never seen Body Heat?
I would say we're having a Skype Zooming, and I think that we should live tweet it because I can't stop talking about my love for this book on Twitter, and I have now started calling this book tour the unofficial Body Heat Appreciation Book Tour.
And I'm sure that your publicist thinks that's super.
Yeah, she's
perfect.
Benevolent about it.
She's like, I've had authors do worse.
Yeah, exactly. She's like, that's all right.
Okay. any possibility of a true crime podcast with you two. Unfortunately, Hallie's already been tortured by being on the Unlikable Female Characters podcast that I co-host.
Tortured? Are you kidding? I basically want to invite myself on as the fourth host. I love talking with you guys.
Just show up, just like get hold of the link and just like pop into the sessions.
Right. And
Hey
just
guys.
be like, hey guys, it's me. And they'd be like, what? But we could, I know you have a lot of interest in the San Francisco serial killer, the Doodler, who's never been caught, and I think is kind of due for a true crime renaissance. So anytime you want to collaborate on a project, Wendy, I'm around.
I do. I would like that. I am obsessed with the Doodler. If you haven't heard of him, I'm not obsessed with him. I don't think he's a cool guy. I'm obsessed with the fact that he, in the 70s, was able to successfully target gay men in the Castro, and that he was able to kind of escape. Well, a lot of serial killers don't get caught, but in particular, I feel sensitive feelings about that guy.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Do you know the serial killer Dennis Nielsen?
I don't know.
British from the 1980s, and he too targeted gay men, which is part of the reason that he got to operate with impunity, was the police were less likely to look into it. But there was just a really well done TV show that came out with David Tennant starring as Dennis Nielsen, and it's
I could see that. He kind of looks like him.
Right? And so it's called Des. Highly recommended.
What's it called?
Des, DES.
Okay.
If you like serial killer content, which I know you and I do, and I think probably some people on the call do.
Yeah. Here's a quick question. This should be our last question because we're about to wrap it up. What do you feel like the place is in talking about true crime without romanticizing, fetishizing, all these types of things?
I think that's like the question, right? Because like true crime is not going away. If anything, our appetite for it is increasing. And I think that there has to be a better adherence to ethical standards about like, what does that mean? When are you elevating somebody by talking about their crimes? And when do you need to switch the focus to the victims? And like, is there a way that it could be victim-centered without talking about the serial killer? Because like so often too, part of what goes into the serial killing is this desire for attention and for coverage. And so it really is kind of this sick thing that the more you talk about them, even in kind of trying to untangle things in an ethical way, you're also feeding into what they want. And that's pretty gross. Ivy Pacoda has that new book that came out this year called These Women, which I think does such an interesting job of trying to write about a serial killer without like glorifying a serial killer, with like really making it victim centered. I think she did a great job.
Yeah, because there's that thing of like, I don't want to be remembered as the worst thing that ever happened to me that I had no control over,
Right.
that ended my life.
Right.
You know, that's not what you want to be remembered. You have a whole life.
And you certainly don't want to, when you're talking about those crimes, spend your whole time talking about somebody who's this destructive force either, you know? Yeah.
Yeah. I think about that a lot working in this genre.
Right. There's a responsibility in writing about crime, I think, because there are so many real life crimes out there, and you have to be able to also like hold the weight of that and not just like, that's the problem with the dead girl trope too, right? It's like, it's just so easy to like write these dead girls into books. And it's like, yeah, but that's not fair. That's not, I don't know. Is that ethical? Even with fictional characters.
Mm-hmm. Well, Hallie, it's been a pleasure, as always.
This was so fun. Thank you, everyone, so much for coming. This was lovely.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you, Wendy. This was so much fun to talk with you, as always.
As always. Next time we'll be in person.
Yes.
Yay! Well, I hope we get to celebrate the next book with both Wendy as well as you, Hallie, in person. Yeah. This was such a fun event. Also, I confess, fellow true crime junkie is in your presence as well as many in the comments. I actually don't know crime junkies because I feel like what you said is so important, the respect when you're talking about stuff. Because there's comedic true crimes, and sometimes I get it. And sometimes I'm like, I don't know. It's such a hard line. It's like you said, it's such a very hard thing to find the right place on.
It is, and I think with the comedic moments, like that can be a coping mechanism, right? For like the very scary things that are in the world, and yet at the same time, it's like this was a real person with a real family, and real people. Yeah,
total coping mechanism. That reminds me of my dad. It's like the old dad jokes of just making humor to make everything that's uncomfortable feel okay.
Right.
But I want to thank you guys so very much for joining us. Everyone, go out and purchase The Lady Upstairs. It sounds just ridiculously awesome. My roommate, I'm legitimately going to go recommend it to her because she loves true crime as well as all of the like awesome thriller stuff that's in your book. So I'm literally about to go sell your book to my roomie. But everyone, thank you for joining us. Thank you for your comments and your questions. And we will see you guys next time. Have an amazing night, everyone.
Have a great night, everybody. So good to see you.